the Destruction skill in the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. Now, it is incredibly powerful, and this lady right here, she is the master trainer for Destruction. So if you ever want to get your Destruction to 100, this is the lady to go to. You just need a boatload of gold to do it. She's not part of any faction. Here she is on the map. There's no requirement to go and find her. She's just right by Vivek or Saran, doesn't matter which one. And you just run to her. There's a lot of tips for training. I'm not going to talk about those today. Really what I want to focus on is just how powerful the skill of Destruction can be. Now, everybody knows about shooting fireballs, making them blow up, and killing people. But today we're going to do a bit of a deep dive and talk about more of the specific mechanics within the Destruction School of Magic in Morrowind. It might seem like Morrowind has a lot of different spell effects within the Destruction skill. However, as you can see, many of them are not found within the game. Damage skill, stunted magicka, other than the Atronach, weakness to blight disease, weakness to normal weapons. These things are not available as spells, potions, scrolls, weapon enchants, or I'm assuming that means armor enchant. So we're going to get started by talking about how do we increase this skill. Like all skills, the experience to increase it is one more than your skill level. So if I'm at skill level 10, I need 11 experience to gain a Destruction skill level. Now, the amount of XP that you gain per cast is based on whether or not you specialize in it or you picked it as a major or minor skill. So the base experience gained for casting a spell, and this is for all schools of magic in Morrowind, is 1. Now, technically, the way the math works in the background of the game is that these things reduce your experience required, but it's easier for me to understand if I think of it as how much experience do I gain instead. So functionally, the math will be identical, but technically this isn't how the math works. Not important though. This column here is assuming that I chose Destruction as a major skill and I specialized in it. So if I start with a Destruction skill of 50, to get to 51, I would need to cast 31 successful Destruction spells to get to level 51 and gain that skill increase. Unlike Oblivion and Skyrim, these spells do not need a valid target. So in Oblivion, when you made a custom spell, you might put weakness on self because then it has a valid target. If you do that same thing in Morrowind, you don't need to hit a valid target. You just need to cast the spell and that will always gain you experience. Or I could spend a few hundred gold and go to a trainer and gain that skill increase. You might be able to see these gold per cast. I took a base trainer cost, which is 10 times the skill level. Now, if you have a low disposition with a trainer, it will be higher than this, or if you have a very high disposition, it will be lower than this. Your mercantile skill affects it as well, and same with your trainer's mercantile skill. But typically it's around 10 per skill level. The amount of gold you have to spend per cast that you would have spent is about the same at each level. So there's no real benefit to training early or training late. No matter what, you're going to save about the same amount of time per gold, if that makes sense. You can start with Destruction higher by picking it as a major skill. Major skills start with a bonus 25 points, meaning you'd start with 30. Minor skills a bonus 10. Magic specialization would give you a bonus of 5. Dark Elves and High Elves start with plus 10. Nobody else gets any bonus from their race. If you have a 56% base cast chance, which is 2 times your skill, plus 1/5 of your willpower, plus 1/10 of your luck, if that's at least 56, you start with this spell, Fire Bite, which doesn't really cost a ton of gold, but it's nice to have anyway. Enough of that boring crap. It's time for weakness stacking. In Morrowind, all the weakness spells have a base cost of 2, but Fire and Frost are by far the cheapest damaging spells. Shock has a base cost of 7, and Poison damage has a base cost of 9. Damage Health has a base cost of 8, and that would fall under Weakness to Magicka, which would boost it. Weakness to Disease is a worthless spell. The only time you would ever use this is to make yourself more susceptible to disease to become a vampire. If you follow the main quest, you can become immune to common diseases, so this weakness on self would allow you to get infected by a vampire. Weakness spells function very differently than they do in Oblivion. So in Morrowind, a weakness spell will happen before any spell after it. So if you just put it first on your spell list from a single custom spell, it will boost everything below it. For example, if I do weakness to fire 50% for 1 second as the top spell, and my next spell is fire damage for 20 points, well, I would deal 30 points of fire damage. However, you might notice this would cost 20 magicka and deal 30 damage. If I took out the weakness and just dealt 30 fire damage on a touch spell, well, that would only cost 15 magicka. So for the same amount of damage, I'm just spending an extra 5 magicka because I added this weakness spell. The base costs here are way too high. All the weakness spells have a base cost of 2. So for Fire and Frost, which only have a base cost of 5, well, it's kind of meaningless to use a weakness spell early to mid-game because you would spend more magicka to deal less damage. Now, weakness spells are great because the custom spells can go up to 100%. So from now on, we're going to be assuming that any weakness spell I'm talking about is 100% magnitude because I'm done with that 50% bullshit. What this means is, if I start with the weakness to fire 100% for 1 second, it will double any subsequent fire damage. On touch, that costs 20 magicka. On target, well, we would multiply that by 1.5. Which means it would cost 30. So for this to break even, it would mean that any subsequent fire spells would have to have a final cost of 30 as a target spell or 20 as a touch spell. At one duration, that break-even point is 40 damage. I could deal 40 damage with a weakness spell for 60 magicka to deal a total of 80 damage. Or I could remove the weakness spell, just deal 80 damage for 60 magicka. It breaks even at this point. And what that means is beyond this point, the weakness to fire is actually increasing your damage. So if we look at this graph, every point below 40, and this X is your magicka cost, Y is the damage you're dealing, every magicka cost below 40, if you have a one duration spell, well, it's going to be more beneficial to just not use a weakness spell. But as we get to crazy magicka costs that you're willing to spend, because if you look, if you're willing to spend 70 magicka, you're going to do 200 damage. Where if you're just doing 70 magicka of straight fire damage, well, that would be 140. Now, you can actually only get up to 100 fire damage without a weakness spell, and that would cost 50 magicka. And we can see that here. 100 fire damage is 50 magicka. If you want to make it 70 magicka instead, well, now you're doubling that effect. Before we move on how to really do a lot of damage with spells, just so you know, weakness to magicka does not improve elemental damage. We will come back to it when we combine duration with weakness spells, but if something has weakness to magic and weakness to fire, like a high elf for example, those are not multiplied together for fire damage. Only the weakness to fire boosts the fire damage. Something you might have noticed as we've gone on here is there's a 2 beneath the duration. So the multiplier that you get for duration when making a spell to your magicka cost is actually your duration plus 1. So going from a duration of 1 second to 2 seconds, well, that will double your damage, but the multiplier only goes from 2 to 3. So what that means is if I have a fire spell, or frost, doesn't matter, for 10 damage with a duration of 1, well, that will have a final damage of 10, and the magical multiplier will be 2. If I up it to 2 seconds, well, now it's 20 damage, double damage, but the magical multiplier is 3, and this goes all the way up to 20 seconds. This table on the right shows going from 1 to 2 seconds, well, that's 100% of a damage increase, but it's only a 50% magicka increase. 2 to 3 seconds, well, again, from 2 seconds, that's another 50% damage increase, going from 20 to 30 damage. However, the magicka increase is only 33%. So these first few seconds of increases have massive damage increases and much lower magicka increases. After you get about 6 or 7 seconds here, these damage and magicka increases start to converge, and they become about the same. Going from 19 to 20 seconds, well, it's about a 5% damage increase and about a 5% magicka increase. So what you should take from that is 3 seconds is great, but after 3 seconds, that bonus drops out pretty much dramatically, and it's nearly worthless after 7 seconds. So I like to keep my spells between 3 and 5 seconds. That seems to be a good sweet spot. Obviously, if they're too long as well, you'll just be running around waiting as your enemy kills you, and your damage slowly ticks away. Don't forget, too, that many enemies can actually dispel effects on themselves or heal up. So if they're extra slow, too, with a really long duration, then your chances of killing an enemy are much lower. I think this orc here just dispelled that, so I'd have to cast it multiple times to kill her, even though the full spell should kill her enough just on its own, but she gets chances to heal. Hey, she died though. Nice. Just to highlight the value of weakness spells, so these two on the bottom here, this purple and green, this represents the grass we were looking at before. Purple is fire damage with no weakness, green is the cost and the damage with weakness spells. These red and blue lines are if you have 3 second duration. So remember, the X value is how much magicka you're spending. So if we're all the way over at 40 magicka, well, these ones were breaking even at 80 damage for 40 magicka. But 40 magicka for 3 seconds, well, that will deal 120 damage, whether you use a weakness spell or not. And what happens is late game, you switch to this blue line. Early game, you should be on this red line. At no point should you really be relying on spells that only last for 1 second because they're just way worse. That's these purple lines. They're not very good. Let's ignore those 2 lower lines here. Erase those. Start with the red line. As soon as you get to casting spells that are more than 40 magicka, well then switch to the blue line and you can skyrocket to the moon. So here's a sample spell, weakness to fire 1 second on target for 100%. That would cost 30 magicka. And adding to that fire damage, 40 damage for 3 seconds costs 60. So this would be 90 magicka for a total of 240 damage. Keep in mind, you never need to increase this duration beyond 1 second because it's on the same spell. Even if this fire damage was for 10 seconds, it would still benefit it for the entire 10-second duration of the spell. If we wanted to ignore that weakness, well, the most I could do with that same spell is 60 for 3 seconds for 90 magicka. And that will deal 180 damage. So it goes from 180 damage for 90 magicka up to 240 damage for 90 magicka. So same amount of magicka, but a bunch more damage. I also want to quickly add, unlike Oblivion, there's no reason to add multiple damage type. There's no exponent in this formula. Oblivion had that to the power of 1.28. This is just adding and multiplying, adding and multiplying. Okay, next we're going to have to add in weakness to magicka. Now this is very different than it was in Oblivion, but if you have this first in a custom spell at the very tippy top, then the weakness to fire that comes after it will be doubled. So you only need 1%. So you only need 1 second of 100% weakness to magicka. That costs 20 on touch or 30 on target. After that, you would have weakness to fire for 1 second at 100 magnitude. That costs 20 on touch or 30 on target. And the weakness to magicka will cause your weakness to fire to be 200%, meaning your fire damage will now be tripled. Now, this has a very high starting cost. So if you're spending something that's a cheap spell, this is absolutely not worth your time. But late game, if you're an apprentice or an atronach and you have a 300, 400, 500 magicka pool, well then spending 115 magicka to deal 700 some damage might be worth it to you. This would be, obviously it says down here, 60 fire damage for 4 seconds, dealing a total of 720 damage for 115 magicka. Now we can't talk about magic in Morrowind without talking about failure to cast chance. And the formula is pretty straightforward. You take your skill, multiply it by 2, add that to 1/5 of your willpower, add that to 1/10 of your luck. That's your base cast chance. Then you subtract the spell cost and any sound that has been cast on you. After you've done all of that, you multiply that by your fatigue modifier, whether that's 0 at 0.75 or 1.25 at 100% fatigue. So if I wanted to cast that spell that costs, what did we say, 115 magicka? Well, at 100 skill and 100 willpower and at max fatigue, I could very easily cast it. Even at 50% fatigue, I'm still casting this spell, but at no fatigue, well, I'll be down to about an 82% chance to cast that spell, even with 100 skill and 100 willpower. Also, if I only have 50 skill instead of 100, even with the max willpower, that's still only an 11% chance to cast a spell that expensive. Obviously, early game, your skill might be 40 with your willpower of 40, and you'd be casting spells that cost something like 15. As you gain more skill, you'll keep that chance up, so you cast weaker spells as you start the game. Now, keep in mind, this is all skill does. It increases your chance to cast. It does not increase the damage of your spells. It does not reduce the cast cost of your spells. It just increases the chance that you will successfully cast. And what this leads to is, well, destruction is very valuable early on up until you can get enough skill to cast all the spells that you want to. But after you get it to that point, you have 100% with no fatigue, well, it goes down in value quite a bit. In fact, early game, even if you pick it as a major skill and start with 30 skill, well, this table here is representing different amounts of fire damage on touch, just with 1 second spell. This is your spell cost chance at 25 destruction skill, 50 willpower, 40 luck, and full fatigue. So not with 0 fatigue, this is with the 1.25 times multiplier. Your percentages are from 70 to 17% chance to cast these different spells. However, when you bump it up to 60 skill, well, even 100 fire damage on touch would still have over a 100% chance to cast. So, of course, we're going to look at some graphs. The X value of these graphs are the cost of the spell you're trying to cast, and the Y value is your percent chance to successfully cast the spell. Notice I made the equations a little simpler so they're easier to read. The red line is 25 skill, so it's plus 50, 50 willpower, so it's plus 10, and 40 luck, so it's plus 4. This is subtracted from your spell cost, and then that's multiplied by 1.25 because we're at max fatigue. This is 70 destruction skill, 90 willpower, and still 40 luck. Notice that on this red graph, it is never 100% chance to cast any spell, even if the spell was somehow free. Even bumping it up to 30 destruction, assuming we pick it as a major skill, you still never have a 100% chance to cast any spell. And this gets much worse when you have 0 fatigue. With 0 fatigue, at best, even a very cheap spell costing 5 magicka will have about a 50% chance to fail. And this is assuming you pick destruction as a major skill. So it will level very slowly and it will be quite a disaster casting spells in combat if you're running around. This is destruction. I'm not talking about other schools of magic right now. If you're running around trying to cast fireballs early game, even if you're specializing in destruction, it's just not going to function very well. However, as you get that skill up, I could do a spell that costs 25 magicka, have no fatigue on this green line, and still have over a 100% chance to cast it. At max fatigue, I would need to be casting spells over 80 magicka to have any chance of failing them. Which, if you know anything about magicka pools in this, they are not much above 300, 400 late game. And typically, if you're just a character who didn't specialize in any magicka boosts, at 100 intelligence, you have 100 magicka, so you would never be casting spells like this. Even a mage who's spamming destruction spells typically isn't going to want them to be more expensive than 70 or 80. And this is only at 70 skill. You can still add 30 more skill to this, and just the value of the skill dramatically plummets as you get it above 75. Because all the skills that you want to cast are already going to be 100% anyway. Those last 10 skills, going from 90 to 100, well, unless you're a mega wizard who's casting massive bombs on people, you're going to have 100% always to cast anything. And so the last 10 points don't help you whatsoever. I also wanted to make sure you see how frustrating it is to even cast very weak spells if you have low skill. You know, I wasn't talking about 5 skill because last time I did that in a different Morrowind video, people got really upset. Obviously with 5 destruction skill, even with max fatigue, it's just a total disaster. You're not casting anything, and I think I'm actually okay with that. The last thing I want to mention is the area. So if you're doing a fireball, adding 50 area just adds 50 divided by 40 times your base cost magicka to your final cost. If that didn't make any sense, well, it's additive. This spell costs 30. If I add 10 area, it goes up to 31.25. Every 10 area is going to cost another 1.25 forever. And the max area you can do is 50. It's linear. And what that means is adding 50 area at early game and low levels is really difficult because you don't have a high magicka pool, you don't have a high destruction skill, you can't afford to add that 10 magicka to this spell. In fact, look, it's at 0, it's 30. At 50, it only goes up to 36.25 on a touch spell. So for fire damage, for touch, adding 50 area, whether it's the weakest spell in the game or the strongest spell in the game, adds only 6.25 area. So late game, you get to add 50 area to anything you want, and it's a very small change to your magicka cost. But early game, it's pretty much out of the question because adding that, well, that could be doubling your spell cost, so you don't want to be doing it. So that's how area works. In fact, adding 50 area to a weakness spell, because it only has a base cost of 2, would add 2 magicka to a touch spell or only 3 to a target spell. So if you have a cheap spell effect with a low base cost, adding area is only multiplied by that base cost, not by the magnitude or the duration. As you can see from this footage, with just a few Fortify Intelligence potions, because I have such a high multiplier from being a high elf with the Apprentice sign, this also works as a high elf with the Atronach sign, as many of you know. You can easily get enough magicka to just fly around and blow up anything you want. Adding 50 area really did not make this spell much more expensive. And even though many of these guards here are Dark Elves, they're still dying very quickly. That 75% resistance is removed, and it's replaced with 25% weakness. Then I'm dealing 90 damage. With 25% weakness, that's going to bump it up to just over 112 damage, killing most of these guards in 2 hits. And because of the massive area, it also goes around corners. It gets anyone hiding in any nooks or crannies. It's a big area. It's a sphere. That's the radius. There are a lot of effects that I have not yet gone over, but the last one I'm going to go over today is the Drain Health effect, because most of these are very similar to what they were in Oblivion. And due to the fact that most enemies in Morrowind die very quickly, draining their fatigue, draining their attributes, or damaging their fatigue or magicka seems a little more silly to me. It still has some purpose. There's some skills where you'll want to damage their fatigue because you have to knock them out. So if you have a quest where you're supposed to punch somebody until they get knocked out, you can instead damage or drain their fatigue. But we're going to talk about Drain Health. So Drain Health, remember, Drain is a temporary effect. Damage permanently damages an attribute like health. So it's just like fire damage. Damage health works the same way as any other damage. But Drain Health temporarily lowers it, both the maximum and the current. So if they have 100 out of 200 health left and I drain their health by 100, they just die. If they had 200 health left, well, then they would lose 100 health, and then when the duration ended, if it was for 1 second, well, after 1 second, they would go back up to 200 health. So it's really just for killing blows. The strongest spell you can make with Drain Health is to add a weakness to magicka first, so that would cost 60 on touch to deal 200 damage, or to drain their health by 200 points. Just to quickly show you how more effective it is, well, Drain Health is a base cost of 4. Frost and Fire damage have a base cost of 5. Shock has a base cost of 7, so I haven't been talking about shock damage much. Few enemies resist it outside of Nords, and that's why it has a higher base cost. However, that's so significant that I would only ever make a Fire and a Frost spell unless you were going for the aesthetic of a shock damage spell. Same with Poison. That base cost of 9 is just absurd. It's only for role-playing purposes, really. Plus, a lot of things have immunity to poison, so that one's just bad in general. Typically, I use Frost damage to kill Dark Elves, and any Daedra enemies that I know have resistance to fire, and I use Fire damage to kill everything else, like Undead and Nords and the like. Drain Health, because of this, can be a nice addition to your toolkit, but the fact is the difference is not that high. If we look at the difference between Drain Health and Frost damage in Oblivion, Drain Health has a ton of value because it's so much cheaper. Where in Morrowind, you could use it, it's slightly more efficient. Honestly, I just don't even bother, because typically I'm killing things enough with Frost and Fire damage. A 20% reduction is not going to justify me not dealing permanent damage. If this doesn't kill your enemy, it's a complete waste of a spell. Last thing I can quickly talk about is Disintegrate. It does cause people to unequip a weapon, so you can disintegrate someone's armor, cast Calm on them, and then pickpocket that armor from them. Seems a little ridiculous to me. Typically when I'm playing Morrowind, I would just kill the person if I really wanted it, and accept the consequences of my actions. That's something I love about Morrowind, but this is a little workaround that if you really don't want to be killing people. That's all I got for my Destruction Deep Dive. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed.